So Phyllis Tickle, in her book, The Emergent Church, brings out an incredibly important principle for us, that something dramatic happens in the church every 500 years. And so we just celebrated last year 500 years since the Reformation. And she says after the Reformation, the future of the church was quite different to the past of the church. You go back another 500 years, you have the Great Schism in the church, between the Orthodox Church was emerged and the Catholic Church, and the future looked a bit different from the past. Then you go back to another 500 years to Gregory the monastic movement, and the future of the church looked different from the past. You go back to Jesus, the great reformer, and after he had come and established his kingdom, then the future of the church looked quite different to the past. And so we could go on and follow that all the way right through to the New Testament. So here we are now. We're in this transition period. We're at this 500-year mark. And some historians would say in those 500-year transitions, there could be between 60 to 120-year digestion period or crossover period. And so we are having topics and discussions now. So when people talk about the church, they talk about the simple church. They talk about messy church. They talk about organic church. They talk about attractional church. They talk about incarnational church. And we're using all of these terms because we realize what we have is fine, but it's not what's intended. And so we are beginning to explore and look at what possibilities there are. In fact, as we look at the early church, what we currently have is quite different to what the early church had. The early church had no buildings for 300 years, very few paid staff, and yet their effectiveness in the world, on society, is they saw over 25% of the then known population come to faith, and an impact of Jesus and his kingdom upon society. So even in countries today where you have a large percentage of Christians, I've just come back from Uganda, and some say up to 85% of the population is born again there, and yet the effect of born-again Christians on society is minuscule. There's as much corruption in the church as there is out of the church. There's corruption in government, there's systemic poverty everywhere, so the impact of the gospel is very limited. And so going forward, some of the things that I think are going to look a little different is the church is going to become more organic than organized. So as oftentimes the church starts with an organic movement. It starts with energy and life and passion. And then as it loses that, it gets highly organized. And some would say disciplined, and others would say become very dead and boring. But the church is an organic organization. It's not just an organization. And going forward, we're going to see that. We're going to see much more ownership from the believer and not just from the leaders in the church. There is much more ownership of the commission of Jesus to go into all the world and preach the gospel. They're not going to be looking for permission from leaders of congregational gatherings to do what Jesus has called us to do. And so I think there's going to be a greater empowerment of the body, which is obviously seen in many other parts of the world where the church is growing incredibly rapidly. It's the body doing the work of Jesus and not just leaders preaching from pulpits.
Alpha.